All right, so yes, now you can go ahead and start. All right, so should we get started with the webinar? First, I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar using the activities for little apps, rare and common. This is September 19th, 2019, and the MAA is helping to present this webinar. We will be recording this webinar so that people can watch it later. The recording, the MAA is recording it. They retain the right to show it, and you agreed to be part of this. There are some guidelines. So we do ask that we will be having a question and answer period at the end. And at that point, we will ask you if you want to ask any questions. If you want to verbally ask, you can unmute yourself at that point and ask the questions. If during the webinar you'd like to ask a question, you're more than welcome to use the question answer button in the Zoom to ask your questions, and we will be monitoring that and answering questions as they come up. There will also be a survey at the end, and we'd appreciate any feedback to continue developing MAA's webinar programs. So, Kelly, you want to start?
Sure, great. Yeah, so I'm excited to be here. Excited that you all are here. So I'm Kelly McConville. I teach statistics at Reed College.
And I'm excited you're all here too. I'm excited to be here. And my name is Kate Kozak. I teach mathematics and statistics at Coconino Community College in Flagstaff, Arizona, in case anybody's curious.
And I'm Grace Murin, the programs assistant here at the MAA, just here to help facilitate this webinar, but I'm excited to listen in as well.
Okay, and if you that are out there could actually also introduce yourselves, we can either unmute you, or if you could go into the chat window and
I am enabling them to talk now, and unmuting. So both of you folks should be able to talk now, though I believe Larry Gordon may need to go and unmute on his own computer if he wants to verbally introduce himself.
So, Gregory, do you want to introduce yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'm Greg Kent from Yakima Valley College in Washington State.
Great.
I've been teaching statistics for about 10 years now.
Wonderful. And Larry?
Yes, Larry Gordon from Antelope Valley College in Palmdale, California, up north of Los Angeles.
Wonderful. Well, welcome to the webinar, and please ask questions during it if anything comes up. Like I said, we'll have you do that in either the chat window or the question and answer.
All right, and gentlemen, I'm going to go ahead and on my end just mute you guys just to cut down on any background noise we may be getting from attendees. So please don't take offense.
All right. So this is just kind of a little outline of what we're going to be doing during the webinar. Is we're going to kind of go over the webinar, the StatPREP website, just to make sure you know how to find things on that website. We also will be going over an overview of the website activities that we have developed for little apps. And then we will go through a little app, the common and uncommon little app activity. And you'll notice that in the chat window, Kelly's actually copied these links. You can actually go there yourselves and see and explore around. So the first thing is an overview of the StatPREP website. So I'm going to go into that. This is our StatPREP website. This is kind of how everything works. You could have found out information about the webinar. There's hubs. I believe both of you have been involved in a hub, but if you have not been involved in a hub, we still have some hubs going on for this following June, actually. And they're listed in here. You can find out information about them and what to do before the webinar, what to do kind of after the webinar, after the workshop, and some other information you can get from there. All of the webinars we've done in the past have been put into the webinar series, so you can go watch any of the previous ones we've done. This one will also be put in the webinar series on the StatPREP website. You can also apply to a workshop. We are having workshops this summer in June. The application is not active just yet, but it will be active very soon. We have newsletters that we've put out. So you can go into those newsletters, read information about what's happening in StatPREP around the country. You can get more information about the StatPREP through why we started, who we are, and the organizations that are supporting StatPREP. We are a collaboration between MAA, AMATIC, and ASA. The most important thing are the resources. We have little apps that we've created that you can use in your classrooms. They're all web-based and they're all free. We have activities for those little apps that we're going to be showing you one of today. We have some R tutorials if you want to know a little bit more about R and how to use it. You can also use these with your students. We have instructor tutorials if you want to learn about some different topics and statistics you may not know enough about yet. You can also use those in your classes, but they're really geared towards instructors. We have places for you to find data sets. And then we also have MAA Connect, which is a way we're organizing and talking to each other. We also have all the workshop and hub leaders information on here. So if you've been to a workshop and you want to talk to somebody about what was happening, you can click on there and find out the contact information for those people. We're going to go into the activities for little apps and show you that. So in this, we have it organized differently depending on what the little app is you're going to work with. So right now we see bootstrapping is at the top. We have explaining variation. These are more topic likes. They're not actually the little apps themselves necessarily. These are more little topics that go with them. Introduction to data graphics, and different activities you can do. So I won't go through all of these, but these are there for you to look at and play around with those little apps. Back up here at the top, we also have the class activities that go with each of these. These are actually more higher topic levels. So this will show you how to do, like if you want to do something on jittering, you can go and find those activities. If you want to do something on data graphics, you can find activities for that. If you want to go and talk about variables in the unit of observations, there's activities just for that you can go and work into. You can click on those and it'll take you directly to the activities that are graded for those. That's kind of what we're doing. We also have some real data. There's a link directly to the little apps also on here. So this is all for you to kind of utilize and play around with. The schedule is for the workshops we've done. So if you've gone to a workshop and you want to find out more about the schedule of what we did and see what was happening those days, you can go into there also. And then we have where you can go and suggest different topics you might be interested in. So that's kind of those two activities. Those two, the activities for the little apps. Now we're going to kind of go into the idea of one of the little apps.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to now share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Can you all see the slides again?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so the little app that we're gonna play around with today is trying to look at what observations would we consider common, what observations would we consider uncommon, what observations would we consider rare. And so really, if you think about what statisticians like to use as their sort of measure of trying to decide between whether things are common or rare, we often talk in terms of standard deviations. But it's important to note to your students that, right, it's not just standard deviations. The statisticians aren't the only ones who use standard deviations as sort of a measure of commonality. So also the Supreme Court uses that, right, when they're trying to talk about whether or not they think evidence is compelling. They'll talk about, well, is it more than 2 or 3 standard deviations away from what we would expect? And so it's good for our students to get comfortable thinking about measuring commonality in terms of standard deviations. And so, right, we're going to use in terms of language here then to just say if something's within 2 standard deviations, we'll usually think of it as common. More than 3 we'll think as rare. And then things between 2 and 3 we'll sort of say are uncommon. Okay, but what this little app is really going to have us do is kind of think about, well, what do we usually think as common? And then we should really reflect on, well, how far away is that in terms of standard deviations from the center or what we might expect. The other thing I want to just note before we hop into the little app is this also will get your students practicing talking in terms of z-scores, right? So z-scores really are telling us something about how many standard deviations above or below the mean we are. And so again, though, they're talking, and that's them then speaking in terms of standard deviation. So if they understand z-scores, that also helps them get a sense of thinking in terms of how many standard deviations am I away from what I expect. All right, so let's hop right into this little app. Okay, so this is the activity. I'm gonna actually hop into the little app. So can you just let me know, or can you see the little app now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I'm gonna have us do is just sort of explore this. And really, you know, for the participants, I would say it would be a great idea to actually just click on the little app, and as we're talking through it, you know, maybe keep one eyeball on what I'm doing and other eyeball on the app yourself, because I think it is nice to explore it. And really, to me, if you ask me the biggest value of these little apps, it's really to have the students in the driver's seat, right? The idea of having them pull up the little apps and having them, you know, toggling and playing with the sliders and really thinking about what that means, because I think that's where they get so much more learning, right? It's not you standing up at the front of the room and doing it for them. It's really them engaging with the little app themselves and trying to internalize what they're learning. All right, so what I'm going to be doing right now, though, then is I'm going to play around with this little app and be sort of following along with that activity that we linked to. All right, so you might also sort of want to look at that activity. You don't have to have it open right now, but I'm going to kind of highlight some of the things that Thomas and Danny put into this activity. Okay, all right, so let's just first orient ourselves with this little app. So right, the common and rare little app seems to have this blob on the rainbow colored blob, but that's just a density plot. So if your students haven't seen density plots before, you can describe them as sort of like smooth histograms if that's something they have seen before, right? The taller it is, the more frequent we have, or the more observations we have around those values, shorter we have less frequency of those values. Okay, so the default here, then if I'm looking at this blob, it's a graph of coming from the NHANES data set. So I think the NHANES is a really lovely data set because it's rich, it's got lots of interesting variables in it. So right, if I scroll down here, it can show me all sorts of different numerical variables that I could make graphs of. So NHANES stands for the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. So it's this nice real data set, right, taken on a random sample of people in the US. And so we have all these interesting variables about health and demographics. Okay, so the variable that we have open here is age, but I'm actually going to move to looking at height. So we're going to look at adult height. Okay. And part of why it's nice to move to this was, right, it's got this nice bell shape. As I was talking on that slide, right, when we think about frequencies, if we know the empirical rule, right, we know that within 2 standard deviations, we're expecting about 95% of our data. So, right, that's sort of what we're calling common. And then within 3 standard deviations away, we pretty much have captured all of our data. And that's something we can kind of see here by looking at the top of this graph, right? So the top is in terms of z-scores. And so, right, we have our z-scores, our standard deviations away from the mean, either to the left or to the right. And so this is where now I think it's great to have your students kind of play around with things. So you could have them move. So I'm going over right to the left-hand side where I can move these bars. And that's changing what I'm defining as common or uncommon, right? So I could actually move them so that I'm trying to line them up to be approximately 2 standard deviations away in both directions. Maybe I didn't quite get that right, but right, they can sort of play around with that and see if that would be how they would define common heights or not. So really one of the questions we would have you ask them is, well, write down for yourself what you think common heights are, and then see if that really tracks to 2 standard deviations away in both directions or not. So when I was thinking, okay, what are common heights? I'm looking at this axis and I'm going, all right, well, what are my units? And I eventually figured out it was in centimeters. And so I said, okay, well, I think 5 to 6 feet, to me, that's what seems common. And so that corresponds to about 152 centimeters. So I'm just going to move that lower bar to be at 152 to about 183. Right? And so then, right, you can ask your students, well, okay, so what percent of adult heights then are you classifying as common based on sort of your internal definition versus what you're calling uncommon? I look at this and say, oh, I guess I don't hang out with enough tall people because there's actually quite a few people who are over 6 feet. And so maybe my definition of common is not quite what, right, we would at least think of statistically, right? But again, just having your students think about that and then play with these bars, they can get a sense of, well, actually how many people then are actually above 6 feet, right? There's 8% of the population is above 6 feet. So yeah, it's just, this is nice, I think, in terms of having the students kind of play around with these bars, get a sense of how their definition of common tracks with how many z-scores or how many standard deviations away they are, right? Ask them to interpret those bounds that they defined in terms of standard deviations away, and they just get a better sense of what we mean when we talk about z-scores and standard deviations from what we expect. Another thing that's really nice about this app is, and I think this is actually nice about most of them, so I'm going to highlight this just in general, is that I think a pitfall we often have in intro stats is that we focus on sort of univariate analyses, but most of the little apps are really set up that you can analyze more than one variable at once and really think about how that changes your story when you start incorporating more data, right? When we really think about the fact that we live in a multivariate world. And so it's nice that these apps make it easy for your students to interact with more than one variable. So in particular, right, we could add then sex as our explanatory variable here and see how our bars change, right? See what now becomes common and uncommon, all right? And so I didn't change my togglings at all, right? I left them at sort of that 5 to 6 feet, but now that we've toggled by sex, right, we see, as we would expect, right, that, well, actually 6 feet is very uncommon for females. But yeah, it's quite common for males, right? But less than 5 feet is very uncommon for males, but not so uncommon for females, right? So then our ideas of what we think of as common, uncommon, or rare really change then based on the subgroups we might consider, right? So even though for the whole group, my sort of 5 to 6 feet wasn't so bad in terms of trying to think of common versus uncommon. Once I partitioned to different groups, now maybe I would need to change my bounds, okay? All right, so then I'm just gonna hop over to some of these others. So again, if you go over to the activity, there's lots of different data sets that they ask you to explore and kind of think about what those represent. So I'm gonna go to one of the other data sets, births 2014. And so this defaults to a graph of the age of the mother, which is an interesting graph. So I'm actually gonna hang out with this one for a moment. And again, right, we might not have that great of a sense of what we would consider common or uncommon. The activity says, well, why don't we put 10% below? So I'm gonna move this common bar so that there's about 10% below and about 10% above. Right, well, we'll get approximately there. All right, and about 80% in the middle. So again, then I can say, all right, if I've got about 80% in the middle, how many standard deviations away from the center, away from the mean, is it before I start to say, yeah, these mothers' ages are uncommon, right? So it's a little over 1 standard deviation away from the mean that I start to classify the mother's age as uncommon. But again, it's fun then to ask your students, like, well, of the explanatory variables, are there any explanatory variables that you think would impact the mother's age, where the mother's age would maybe be different? What's common for one group might be uncommon for the other. So again, don't give them the answer right away. Have them really toggle and try some of these variables. So whether or not a ventilator was used doesn't seem to impact the mother's age. Thankfully, the sex of the child doesn't seem to impact the mother's age, right? But if they pick pay, they will actually see that pay does seem to have an impact. And so then, sure, that, you know, maybe it's not so uncommon now to be at 20 if the government was paying, but it is still pretty uncommon if private was paying. So again, this idea of once we look at another variable, what we're defining as common or uncommon might change. Let's go back to the NHANES for a moment. And another nice variable that follows a lovely normal distribution is systolic. Well, all right, so it's a little bit skewed, unfortunately, for some people in that upper end there. But this is another one where you can have them say, okay, we're gonna look at systolic. We might try to, again, find bounds for when we think something is common or uncommon. And again, you could either have them mark it at the 2 standard deviations away mark or the 3 standard deviations away mark and ask them what are the systolic blood pressures that correspond with being 2 standard deviations away or 3 standard deviations away. But then you can also ask them again to think about the explanatory variables and say, first, which of these variables might what we consider common and uncommon to change, right? So in particular, we might think something like diabetes might have an impact. And we really do see, right, that longer right tail for the group with diabetes than the group that doesn't. So I guess what I think is nicest about this app is really that there's a lot of playing that the students can do while they're trying to, you know, internalize and understand how to interpret, you know, z-scores, what we would consider common, uncommon, right? How we would see that an explanatory variable really has an impact on that or not. So I think a large part of it really should be, you know, having this be very student driven, right? You can have the students really thinking through what they might think of as common or uncommon, see if that really reflects in the data, and what variables they think would impact that. All right, so that's just a little bit of playing around with that app. We can hop back into it if you have more questions on that. But that's really all we had that we wanted to show you, just a little bit of that little app. So now I'd love to open it up for any questions from the group. And it seems like we have some more people who joined us. So it'd be lovely if those who joined us told us where you teach, who you are.
Right. And I'm unmuting everyone now. You should also be able to do it on your own computer, I believe. All right.
Hello, can you hear me? This is Gayatri Manikandan. I teach at Compton College.
Great. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for showing us all this stuff. Its little app is totally new to me, so I'm just trying to see how it does things.
This is
Beverly?
Beverly Hall from Florida Southwest State College.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And Carol?
This is Carol Howell from Howard Community College. I just joined you 10 minutes maybe ago.
All right. Luckily, we are also recording the video. So if you want to see the first half, you know, you just watch the movie backwards.
Exactly.
So,
So
go ahead.
yeah, I'm just going to hop in here. So either if you have questions about that app, or if you have other questions about the little apps, or really the other thing we would love data on is what else would you like these webinars to be about, right? Because these webinars are really for all of you. So if there are topics or things that you want to see done in the webinars, we'd love to hear about it.
I don't know. I'm just trying to think how to frame this question. Okay, you know, I am trying to use like a OER books for statistics. So I saw this book on OpenMap. So is it like how easy to bring in a little app with any kind of book? Is it like, you know, most of the textbooks and stuff go with the TI-84 calculators. So I'm just trying to, it's just, we can just go to the website and start showing. How will the students get access? Sorry, I'm just totally new learning about this.
That's okay.
So,
I will let you know that what I do for my students is I actually copy either the activities URL, or I actually copy the little apps URL, and I put it into my learning management system so they can access it from there. And they can bring it up in class because it's just all web-based. So they don't need to have any technology besides being able to get into a browser.
okay, so you just copy the link and then so everybody can click on it and play with it. Okay,
Yes. Yeah.
sounds good. Thank you.
You're welcome. And you don't, even if you have a textbook that's tied to certain things, you all are teaching the normal curve. You all are teaching about the usual and unusual. And so instead of teaching that, you can use the little apps to.
Definitely. Yes.
Are there any other questions? So like I said, there are other little apps that we have and other activities that go with them. I just did one yesterday in my class on the variation one to get my students to understand a little bit more about what variability is about. So they're really wonderful because they give students a chance to check in and explore for themselves. And as Kelly was saying, actually be able to look at different explanatory variables and what's happening with those. Are there any other questions?
No.
Let's see.
No, I just need to play around with it for myself to get come up with some ideas.
Yeah.
Right.
Great. And if you're playing around with one of the little apps and you're saying, gee, I wish it could do X, Y, or Z, that's another way you can reach out and say, hey, I mean, because Danny, our fearless leader, who has created most of these little apps, loves feedback like that and would definitely take into consideration.
Okay. I'm kind of playing with the idea of having my students, give the students some kind of question and they have to make some kind of statistical argument with some graphs, use the data sets and the little apps to help that.
Right. And it's very useful for that.
Catherine, can I ask you something a little different from this little app thing, since
Sure.
you are asking me? I was just looking at your book, Statistics Using Technology.
Yes.
I just want to thank you very much for that, because I have been looking for using the OER textbooks, and I like your books. I'm thinking of using it from next semester. But I have a question. Is there any supplement stuff besides the videos? Is there anything else available for us? Something that I could, is there a My Open Math class set up for that, or something like that?
So I don't actually have one, My Open Math, but somebody else created a My Open Math for my second edition book.
Okay.
I don't use those because I personally like my students to write their own interpretations and their own information. So I don't use it myself, but there is one out there. I have a Google Drive that has videos and PowerPoints somebody else produced and solutions to the different editions. And so if you want, you can send me an email and I can send you a link to my Google Drive. And I believe it's on there how to get into My Open Math.
Okay, sounds good. Can you type your email address so that I don't want to go?
Right.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. I really appreciate it.
So I do want to mention that we would like to have you do a survey. I put the survey in the chat room. And so if you go into the chat and click on that survey, and I just put a chat with my email address also in there. My email is also on the StatPREP website. My email and Kelly's email are all in there under the head leaders and under the head leaders and instructors. So you can get all of our emails through that. But please fill out that survey. We really appreciate it.
But I don't see the survey on the chat room. In the chat, I don't see the survey.
So let me try to do the survey again. It's like it doesn't give me a return. So let me try to put a return in here. No. So I just put it there right now to all panelists.
Catherine, or Kate, sorry. I think I've got it. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
got it.
Okay.
Yes, I got it. Yeah.
And can you put in my email address? Because I'm not sure about that.
I got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.
All right. Are there any other questions? Well, please play around with the other little apps we have available to you. Really playing with them is the best thing for you, and it really helps you learn what your students can do. And then letting your students play with them is also very useful. And I usually have one student with a computer and everybody else going around, everybody else in that group with that computer, so they can all kind of talk about what to do in that group. It's been working really nicely. So we want to thank you very much for coming to our webinar, and please look out for new webinars in the future. We will have other webinars in the future. We will be putting out information on the StatPREP website and also sending out from MAA about them. We do want to thank the MAA and the NSF for funding the StatPREP. So we do appreciate that. We are a DUE grant, and so we do appreciate all the funding we've gotten from that. And we do appreciate you coming. So thank you very much for coming.
Yeah,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you very much.